Do you wonder how to make the best choices for the yard around your mid-century house? To be honest, so do I. Green things are not my specialty, but I get questions about this all the time from my clients and students, so I reached out to fellow mid-century enthusiast Jim Drzewiecki, founder and principal of Ginkgo Leaf Studio, for some expert opinions on landscape design. We are going to walk you through the first move you can make in upgrading a mid-century yard, how to find design inspiration from your house, even if it's modest, what can be the most costly mistake and how to avoid it, and how to make smart choices for your climate. Look, we all love the Palm Springs effect, but here in the Midwest, we need to use different strategies to achieve that look. You cannot copy-paste a landscape design. So maybe pull out your phone or grab a notebook right now, because you're going to want to hang on to the advice that gets shared in today's episode. Hey there, welcome back to Mid-Mod Remodel. This is the show about updating MCM homes, helping you match a mid-century home to your modern life. I'm your host, Della Hansman, architect and mid-century ranch enthusiast. You are listening to episode 1703. Now, before we get started, I'll just say that you will want to see some of the great designs Jim and landscape designer Hannah Paulson put together for their clients, and you can find them right on their website if you spell the name right. That's ginkgoleafstudio.net, spelled Ginkgo, spelled the right way. Or just hit up the show notes page for key episode takeaways and handy links to their website and some of their project photos. I'm not going to do a pulled out history snippet this week, but if you listen closely, you'll find out from Jim the exact formula for what our grandparents all planted in front of their brand new mid-century homes and why it was so consistent. Basically, there weren't that many options. The planting combination he name checks is exactly what I found in my yard when I moved in, but it's not what Jim or I recommend for you to do to your mid-century yard today. So keep your ears open and you'll hear more. Okay, so here I am with Jim Drzewiecki, who is the moving heart behind Ginkgo Leaf Studio, which specializes in mid-century landscapes, not only in the Midwest, as was the case when we first met each other, but now throughout the country. And I'm so excited to have you here, Jim, to answer all the questions that I cannot about appropriate choices for mid-century landscape design, which I get asked all the time. I want to ask you a little bit about your background and how you got into this generally and specifically, but first, just to give people a taste, do you have an easy tip to make your landscaping choices a little more mid-century, that sort of a guideline or a small project or something to kind of give people a starter point?
Yeah, I think a great starting point is, and it seems so simple to say it this way, but just look at your house, let the house talk to you. And what I mean by that is look at the details, because mid-century homes typically have at least one unique detail, whether it's something on the porch, it's the front door, it's a certain window, it's a roof line. Look for those. And then also we always look at the materials on the house. So, in the Midwest here, we have a lot of what's called Lannon stone, really generically a limestone. So if that's on the house, we're likely going to try to pull that into the landscape somehow. But I always just let the house tell me almost what I should be doing.
Well, I love that advice. That seems very right to me. Marvelous. So you've been working in landscape design, landscape architecture for a long time, but that's not where you started. What was your intro into this field of creative design?
Yeah, well, in fifth grade, I toured the Johnson Wax Center in Racine.
Oh,
and if you can't be inspired by something that Frank Lloyd Wright did, you probably shouldn't be a designer. It was kind of right then and there that I said, I think I want to be an architect. High school came, my counselor said, you're probably not good enough at math to go into architecture.
Oh.
And I thought, well, yeah, I don't like math, but I really want to be an architect. So I went ahead and went to the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. At the time, they were a top 20 school for architecture in the country. And I got a great education there. So I have my Bachelor of Science in Architecture. Went to work for an architecture firm for 2.5 years, but it was the early 90s. And if you know your economic history, that was one of our most recent economic collapses.
Yeah, that was a rough
Um,
time for young designers, wasn't it?
yes. And I thought, oh my gosh, I just went to school for 5 years and now I'm in a profession that I didn't realize followed the economy so closely.
It does. It really does.
And I was still single at the time, but I thought, okay, I want to get married. I want to have a family. This may not be the profession I thought it was. And people were quitting our firm to go work for whatever firm was busy at the time. So I quit without anything lined up. Um, Went to work for a manufacturing company in their engineering department just to have a job doing drafting, but started applying at landscape firms because growing up, my mother gave me a love of plants. I used to help her out in the yard and in the garden. I think I was 14 years old and I was redesigning their backyard for them.
Nice.
And I grew up in a 1968 ranch, so that my parents built. So
Fun.
I think some people have said recently that that was probably imprinted on me and why I appreciate that mid-century house so much because I literally grew up in one. Um, but I thought I really love plants. Maybe that's what I should be doing. And I looked at landscape design as more of a lateral move. I didn't, necessarily have to give up 5 years of college,
Right?
but no one would hire me, no surprise, because I had no experience. Then I had moved out of my parents' house. My sister calls me out of the blue and says, "You got a letter here from a landscape company. They want you to come in for an interview." And so I did, and they hired me as a CAD drafter initially. But the longer I was there, I started getting little chances to design little pieces of projects. And by the time I left there 12 and a half years later, I was doing designs for projects that were being overseen actually by the owner of the company.
And you couldn't stop yourself from just getting the design thinking in there while you were doing the technical
Correct.
drawings.
Yep.
Well, that's the
Um,
sign of someone who's in the right profession.
for sure. And then at 12 and a half years, my wife said, if you're not happy entirely with how that company is doing things, she's the one who said, well, why don't you start your own business and do it the way you want to? 17 plus years later, here we are.
You're still doing it. So it was the right thing. But when you started your own business, you weren't necessarily focusing only on mid-century yards. You were doing beautiful yards of a number of varieties around your local area, right?
100%.
Mhm.
When you have no clients because you're brand
Right.
new, as you know, um, yes, I was doing any kind of landscape design that someone wanted, and we still do. I should
Mhm.
point that out. But as time went on, we started to notice that probably 50% of our work, before we even decided to focus on it, because there's just so many mid-century homes in the southeast Wisconsin,
Yeah.
um, we suddenly had this fairly decent portfolio of mid-century work that we had done without even realizing it.
Oh, that's interesting. That's where I first noticed you, of course, because I moved back to Wisconsin and fell into my obsession with mid-century
Right?
deeply. But I saw that you did other types of houses. Do you have a preference? Do you feel like you still like to do the other projects too, or does it feel like, well, do you have a favorite style at all? Is it mid-century even?
It definitely is mid-century. And again, that's probably because I imprinted on that style at an early age. I love ranch homes in general. I just like designing spaces around a ranch house. But we get occasional interesting requests. We've done a few what I call Asian fusion
Mhm.
gardens because by no means would I say I am copying the true Japanese garden style. Um, we've done a totally 100% colonial Williamsburg style rose garden for a client.
Oh,
So
wow.
those still come in, but as we realized this was our favorite style for both Hannah and I, we really have pushed more of our energy towards that. And then we realized that there were quite a bit of areas around the country that also had mid-century homes.
Yeah. Well, it was a huge push in the building boom. And I think it's interesting. You're somewhat unusual in growing up in a ranch house and loving it consistently. I find a lot more people who grew up in mid-century houses that didn't appreciate them when they lived there, but if they love them now, they've kind of come back to a reawakening of that appreciation. But there was a long kind of drought of people liking the mid-century houses that were everywhere, and now I feel like people are seeing them with new eyes and therefore wanting to make great remodeling choices for them and wanting to make great landscaping choices for them too.
I would agree. I do recall that when I was younger, my parents' home was completely filled with Scandinavian style furniture. I
Interesting. That's a little, I mean, I feel like that's a cue towards maybe not mid-century design, but they've always had an eye for design. They've always been designing people, which seems like a logical extension to you.
Yeah.
So many people were trying to turn their ranches into cottages or like fill them with Victoriana in the 80s and 90s. And that was never a great alignment of style eras.
No, as we got older, my siblings and I, though, my parents did go to Ethan Allen Furniture and turned our family room into a pseudo-colonial style furniture grouping.
Wow.
But I mentioned the Scandinavian furniture because although I probably appreciated the home, the architecture, I didn't appreciate the furniture at that time. And
Interesting.
I look back with regret that I didn't, tell my parents, hey, don't get rid of that furniture. Um, I do have their cedar chest from when they got married. It's a mid-century piece. It's a Lane, chest. Uh,
Nice.
but that's the only piece that, I remember from my childhood.
That is, yeah, those things are hard to hang on to sometimes. I'm lucky my parents are kind of hoarders, and when they finally upgraded from my mom's youthful furniture, I have her Scandinavian import store sofa and matchstick
Awesome.
furniture, shelves and things in this house now, which is wonderful. I'm kind of a magpie for found slightly broken objects that I can then
Sure.
nurse back to life and make my own. So you got these early influence, and of course, if the Johnson Wax building woke up your design nature, there's got to be some love for the mid-century era in there. So now more than half of your business is in mid-century, and I know you show up in Atomic Ranch, and I think that since we last spoke, you now do work more outside of the Southeast Wisconsin area. Is that right?
Yeah. It was the middle of the pandemic, is kind of when we took a step back and said, we've been doing a lot of mid-century projects without realizing it. And we thought we both love it. Why don't we try to put more of our energy into that? That's what triggered our interest in advertising in Atomic Ranch. We were lucky enough that I think a year or two prior, Atomic Ranch had reached out to us about one of our projects and said, we
Nice.
do want to write a feature about it.
Well, there are not many people doing great, good looking, mid century appropriate landscaping around mid century houses. I think you are somewhat for the same reason I end up working all over the country. People look for that locally. They want the person that can help them in their town, in their climate zone, and they don't find that person. So then they have to keep hunting and they find someone like you or specifically you.
yeah, Yeah, Atomic Ranch really fell in love with it's a John Randall McDonald house, famous local Wisconsin architect. They fell in love with the house. They wrote the feature. A couple years go by. I reached out to the writer, and she was no longer a writer with the magazine. So then the editor reached out to me and she specifically told me, I remember this because Atomic Ranch is based in California. And if you really read through a typical issue, it's a lot of California style projects, maybe Florida, maybe the Southwest. And she said, our readership is just craving mid-century Midwest. We don't ever write about it. And I said, well, I have lots
too.
of projects I could show you. So that lit the fire under us. And then I also, during the pandemic, started hanging out in various Facebook groups that were focused on mid-century ranches. There's actually a Facebook group that a lot of your listeners will be familiar with. It's literally MCM Landscape Design.
Hmm.
And that led to probably the epiphany for me, which is suddenly people were messaging me and saying, I cannot find a landscape company in Indiana that understands this style.
Hmm.
Or I hired someone, I'm in Kentucky, I hired a local landscaper and they gave me a design that looks just like every other house.
Hmm.
And so Hannah and I said, well, wait a minute. People are used to doing things virtually now. Maybe we should try to offer our services to people in other states. And it's since taken off.
So what does it look like when you do a project remotely that's different from when you do one that you can visit personally?
Really, the only difference, well, two differences. The meetings, of course, are virtual,
Right.
just like we're talking now. Um, the only other difference is instead of me coming out to the property and doing what we call the site analysis, where we take the measurements and we take the photos, we ask the client to do that for us. We have a guide now because we've done so many virtually. We have a
Hmm.
guide that we send to our clients that gives them instructions on how to take the photos and how to take the measurements. That's been very helpful for our clients. And now that's really the only difference in our process.
Right. I mean, so much of design happens at the drawing board or these days in the computer. And so the thinking work doesn't happen. I mean, it's not like an architect sits in the house or the yard of the place they're going to work and does the design work. That in-person contact is magical and I love it when I get it, but there's so much you can give of good advice and good design if you have the right base information that does not actually require being in person.
No, in a perfect world, I would visit every site in person, and I'm
Hmm.
sure you would love to be in every house that you work on in person
Yes.
for more than one reason. Because I love, whenever I meet with a new client that's in a mid-century house, literally, I'm like, could we have a tour first?
Exactly. No, I
I
have
can
to I
see.
have to separate them. I need to do the chatty tour with the owner first, and then I do
Yep.
measurements, and then I photograph, and then we talk about design. We can do chatty tour and then design separately as well, sequentially, but I have to just take it all in first because it's so much fun. That's the for me part and for you part.
Um, we will travel if a client really feels strongly that we need to see their property in person. The woman in Kansas wanted me to come out there, but there were logistical issues. There were no direct flights to anywhere near where she lived. I think the closest city was a 2.5 hour drive away because she's literally in the middle of Kansas. But our client in Delaware, they said, you have to see our backyard in person. Photos will not do it justice. So I try to make that visit basically almost in a 24-hour period. I fly out in the morning. I visit with the client in the afternoon and into the evening. I spend the night and I fly back the following morning.
That sounds overwhelming, but really fun.
It is. I'm not a big fan of flying, so virtual design is totally fine with me. But I'm not going to talk a client out of it if they really do believe it will help the design process for me to see it in person.
Well, that sounds like a good option that you've got in your back pocket then.
Mhm.
So I have been such a fan of your work. It happens actually at the moment. We have a client in common. They have already had been working with you for their landscape design, and we're going to be doing a mini master plan of their kitchen. The house is gorgeous, but someone came in, unfortunately, the previous buyer came in and absolutely destroyed the kitchen that was there. It is, I'll just say, when the client sent me the pictures, I couldn't tell if what I was seeing was like a bad AI rendering of a bad idea of a kitchen or an actual photo of a bad kitchen. That's how fake and off it looks. But we're going to fix it. So that's the good news. And it's really fun that you and I are going to get to collaborate on the inside and outside of this space through those gorgeous big glass windows that kitchen has. But also, I feel like our interests intersect so much, and I get so many questions from my design clients, ready to remodel students, people on Instagram asking, what's the right choice for mid-century landscaping? And I have recently graduated to keeping 5 houseplants alive in my house. But only recently. I don't think I'm the right person to provide that advice, but you are. Let's see, do you feel like there's a question you get asked the most? Or a question that we shared some of the questions we've been getting, something that felt like, oh, of course, that's the most obvious baseline place to start. Where would you begin if you were going to give someone good mid-century landscaping advice?
Well, I definitely think looking at the house and letting it speak to you, let the house tell you what it should have in front of it. And that sounds very esoteric in a way, like, oh, I'm sure the house is going to start talking to me. But what I really mean is look at the details on the house. Even a mid-century modest house usually has one unique detail on it that might say something to you about, well, that's an angled beam holding up our porch roof. What if we made the bed lines angled instead of curvy? If you're thinking about paving, well, then I look at the hardscape materials that are on the house. Is it brick? Is it stone? Well, then likely I may think about repeating that in the landscape. Probably the biggest, it's not always a question as much as it's maybe more my opinion. And we've talked about this multiple times with the Atomic Ranch writers. I truly believe a good mid-century landscape should work off of the context of where it is. And what I mean by that is if it's a house in the Midwest, you shouldn't be trying to make your yard look like it's in Palm Springs.
Yeah. Because it's only, perhaps it's not possible at all. And if it is, only with the greatest of interventions of trying to control for temperature in microclimates, trying to control for water situations, trying to do a lot of externality control that isn't really possible.
Yeah, if you truly study a Palm Springs neighborhood, and I've been to Modernism Week, and I think everyone should go to Modernism Week at least once in their life because it's an amazing 10 days. But when you walk a neighborhood, you can't avoid realizing you're still kind of in the desert. And the simplistic plantings that are done out there where the plants are 6 feet, 8 feet apart, and there's no wood mulch and there's barely any lawn, it's all gravel. Well, that's because the desert around it influenced that style. And of course, the weather. So when I look at a Midwest landscape and I see someone trying to put, like yuccas will grow here, but that's probably the only plant you're lucky enough to be able to replicate that look. But then you put 5 of them in front of your house and you put that ugly white marble chip around it. That's, the 1970s landscape. It just doesn't look like it belongs here. So a Midwest landscape to me should have prairie plants, and we can use ornamental grasses instead of the yuccas and the agaves because an ornamental grass still has that architectural feel to it. But because it's a grass, it looks like it belongs here in the Midwest. And then suddenly the landscape looks like it belongs in the Midwest. And then it fits the house because the house always looked like it belonged in the Midwest.
Right. Same materials, choices that are made because of our weather factors, our sun, our need for insulation. We don't, generally speaking, build post and beam houses with entire walls of glass here either because it tends to not feel very comfortable no matter how much heat you put into it. So yeah, our houses fit the landscape. It makes sense that the landscape should fit the landscape.
And
Or
how many and
on
how many
lawn.
flat roofed houses are here for the
Yeah,
same reason?
very few. And they can work, but they require a lot more structure than one out west because we've got to be able to carry that snow load.
Right.
It's an undertaking
Yeah.
and not always a successful one. There's a higher proportion of leaky flat roofs here in the Midwest than there are.
Correct.
I'll just
For
say that
sure.
as a generality. Yeah. So listening to the house seems like a great starting point that anyone can take a look at their house and see what sets it apart from the neighbors or sets it apart from houses in another neighborhood of another era, and how can you play off those features, pick them up. How much do you feel like if there's a stone element on a house, is can you put too much stone into the landscaping? Do you have a goal of where you want to place it or how much you want to use it so that they feel like they're nicely in conversation with each other?
Yeah, for sure. That's a great question because I hate to say it, but professionals who have done this a long time, we tend to know what details we should be looking at and maybe which details we should be ignoring, number
Mm-hmm.
one. Number two, I think you hit the nail on the head as far as too much of a good thing. So if you had a mid-century ranch that's all red brick, I'm not so sure I would put in a red brick front walk or a red brick patio.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, I would be considering a contrasting material. And in that case, because it's pretty typical, at least on a Midwest ranch, there may be limestone windowsills. There may be a limestone chimney on the brick house. So
Yeah.
I would then go to that lesser used material and maybe pull that into the landscape instead of focusing on the red brick because the red brick walkway would just melt and disappear up against a red brick house.
Got it. So you're kind of looking for the most sort of accent detail of a house to pull from rather than the biggest feature of the house.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
I like that. And I think people do worry too much. I find this on the inside of design as well. People worry about everything needs to match. And mid-century houses aren't really all about matching. It needs to coordinate, but it's possible to have too much matching. And especially if you feel like you're locked in and you only have one option, that's rarely true. It's more of a mental state. Do you feel like when you're looking at a mid-century house, there's particularly in the Midwest in this region, you're right, you're going to see a brick knee wall or a stone knee wall, some accent material. Have you ever had a project where you're just like, this house is too plain, there's nothing to pull from here? You've talked about shapes. Maybe that's the place you go when you can't find a material you're looking for.
Yeah, certainly. Another good question is, are there houses that don't inspire? And yeah, that can happen. Um, but then maybe I'm looking at the overall.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's just the shape of the house. We have one of our very first mid-century project that we truly loved. It's a ranch, and you'd really even not notice it from the street, but the house has a slight crease in it. It bends, not curved, but an angled bend in the floor plan.
Oh, interesting.
It might be off by 10 degrees. Clearly, the builder decided to do that for a very particular reason. And I looked at that and said, well, wouldn't that be interesting to maybe make the bed lines play off of that?
Mm-hmm.
The house now has this angled feature in it. Let's go that way. Um, an L-shaped ranch that has a very deep setback, I might play off of that. Is there a curved or circular window or a curved detail somewhere on the house that we can play off of? Um, it can be a very simple, minute detail. It could be something that's really dramatic and in your face that
Mm-hmm.
you can't avoid not playing off of that detail. So it really depends, of course, house to house.
Mm-hmm. But that makes each design personal and unique too. So that's really fun.
Totally. That's maybe our most favorite part of doing this job is every house is different, every site is different, every client is different. We have a project that we just finished. It's in the Fox Point area of Milwaukee, which is a suburb and a strong mid-century neighborhood there.
Yeah.
The client hired me to do a landscape. Regretfully, they did everything white inside the house when they remodeled the inside.
Yikes.
So
It
they
happens.
wanted, yeah, it happens. They wanted a very simplistic front landscape, though. And I presented the design. I, of course, had some linear groupings of plants and evergreens, but I also had a fair number of flowering perennials. And the wife looked at me during the design meeting and said, "Oh, I guess I should have told you. I really don't like flowers." And I thought, well, yeah, that probably would have been good information to have early on.
Before
Um,
you designed it with black. Yeah.
so I had to take all the flowers out. It really became an all evergreen landscape, not what I would have done. Strangely enough, though, last year the house is sold. The new homeowners reach out to me, not even realizing that we had done the original design. And they basically say, this is not us at all. We want color, we want texture. Can you do a design for it? So I got to correct the mistakes that were made the first time around.
Interesting. Well, hopefully they introduced a little bit more mid-century wood back into the interior of the house
I
too.
think that is their intent, is to skew the inside of the house back to what it should have been.
It's always possible. I mean, this actually leads to an interesting question because I feel like people sometimes come to me with a time capsule house that's amazing, that's so fun too. Sometimes we need to make lifestyle changes, but sometimes we're just polishing. And sometimes people come to me with a house that's been very aggressively modified by previous owners. And we can always reintroduce mid-century details. How much do you feel like, is there such a thing as, I mean, landscape is so much more in flux. Is there such a thing as a vintage yard? Do you find that? Or, and if
That's
so,
a
what would you do with it versus when a house has been, when you're sort of redoing choices from the past? How do you approach those two different situations?
Yeah, if you know your typical, again, in the Midwest, the typical landscape that was done in front of a 1950s or 1960s house was all evergreen shrubs,
Yeah.
either yews or junipers. The yews have to be trimmed constantly to keep them under control. You might have a crabapple in the front yard. You might have a blue spruce in the front yard.
You're
And
describing my yard.
yeah, and or the burgundy, maroon, crimson king maple.
Mhm.
That is the classic 1960s landscape. Because if you look I have a vintage Better Homes and Gardens book that my parents actually owned.
Fun.
And if you page through it, the perennials that were available then were daisies, irises, carnations. I mean, none of the plants that we recognize as perennials nowadays. Ornamental grasses didn't even exist. Those didn't even come into the United States until the late 80s, early 90s.
Wow.
And even tried and true plants like lilacs. Um, Now there's 50 varieties of lilacs versus the one purple lilac and one white lilac that existed back then. So I'm not a fan of someone who says, well, it's a time capsule inside, so I want my landscape to look like that too.
Fair.
There's
Yeah.
just so many more varieties to use now that keeping yews, to me, no, I'm taking away maintenance if I take those yews out and replace them with something else.
It was actually literally the first thing I did to my house because I knew we needed to paint the outside and I knew there was lead paint, so I was going to need to handle it carefully and put down plastic and the whole 9 yards. And I had yews growing right up against touching the house because they had become overgrown. And I went in with the big loppers and the chainsaw and took them out. I felt so murderous about it, but they weren't my style.
We try to avoid taking out healthy living plants on any project we do. But when the yews have grown past the windowsills.
That exactly. Oh my gosh, my neighbor's house across the street, she's not the longest, well, she might be the longest resident now. We've lost a couple people to retirement homes, but they go up to the roof line on the front and she has to climb over them to get to the gutters, and it's quite precarious looking.
We have one now where the yews were planted right next to the front foundation. And of course, it's a mid-century house, so it's got big overhangs. And these yews, you can see their branches all went out trying to reach the sunlight. So they've become half shrubs because the half of the shrub that would have grown towards the house, there was no light, there was no rain. So these yews are completely leaning out towards the sun. And of course, we're going to take those out and put either no plants there because they won't get rained on, they won't get sunlight, or we'll try to find something that could tolerate conditions like that.
Well, that's an interesting question. This is total jump sideways, but if you think about right and wrong choices, I think another reason people have to pull out yews is because they were planted when they were small. As far as my expertise goes, and it's limited, too close to the house. Would you agree that they often?
For sure.
Yeah.
Or the classic spruce tree planted 3 feet off the edge of the driveway because when they planted it, it was 2 or 3 feet tall. It was a baby and it looked cute. And they might have put one on either side of their driveway. But now you drive by that house 50 years later and the new homeowner, has had to limb them up. So they look like pipe cleaner trees.
Yeah. So, I mean, you can put a plant in the wrong place. That's certainly a thing. Is it really anything that's a good idea to plant so close to the house like that? Or really should we not be doing that in any case? From a technical house point of view, I advise against it. I wonder what your perspective is.
Certainly getting the plants out from under the overhangs just is logical.
Good rule of thumb.
Sunlight and rain, kind of important for a plant to survive. Secondly, though, you can probably work with the grate around the house a little easier if the plants aren't right up against the foundation.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, you described your neighbor. I mean, if you have to clean your windows and you're crawling over your shrubs because they're right next to the house, that's another reason to not be planting everything so that it eventually will touch. And people do forget that, if you look online, it's a lot easier nowadays. You can see how big a plant may get.
Right.
But people don't always pay attention to that. And they'll put a shrub that's going to get 8 feet wide and they'll plant it 3 feet away from their house. And then 5 years later, wonder, why does this thing, now taking over our front yard?
Because you didn't check the basic. It's true. We can still forget to do it, but it should be so much easier for us to look up these basic pieces of information. I think a lot of mid-century landscaping was DIY. And maybe there was an advice in a Better Homes and Gardens book or in a magazine, but I don't know how well it was followed or how universally applicable it was, depending on what the market of that.
I can't imagine my parents hired a landscaper to
right
around their 1968 ranch. I am pretty positive they used their Better Homes and Gardens book to choose the plants. They drove to the local garden center and they planted the straight line of yews in front of the family room and the straight line of junipers in front of the living room.
Yep, I had the yews in front of the house and the something else. It sprouts up. It's not a forsythia, but it sprouts up like a forsythia-ish thing, and it stump starts. It's still in front of my fence line, and I haven't had the heart to get aggressive with enough to take it out. But if I get mad at it and cut it down to the stump in the spring, it comes right back up above the fence before the end of the year. I know the previous owner just had a passion for his hedge trimmer, but I don't treat it that way. But yeah, it is. The straight lines, I think were just the easier DIY thing. But now we can do some things that are more interesting. Do you think about, so don't plant under the eave line. Good, logical, I like it. Do you think about creating space with the plantings near the house versus farther from the house? Or are there general rules about that? Or do you look at the lifestyle of the homeowner more than rules of thumb when you're thinking about creating spaces in and out from the house zone in a yard?
Yeah, well, I can answer that question two ways. I do think it's important, just like you do this, we as designers we're balancing the lifestyle of our client, their tastes.
Mhm.
You have some clients who love color, and you can tell by the way they dress or how they pick their furniture. And we use those exacts. We look at that when we meet with a client. We look at how they've decorated the inside of their house because that will influence maybe how much color we use outside. If they're into very eclectic, they've got the Ames chair, but they've got maybe something more tufted and fabricy next to it. I notice those things. And then we can maybe be a little quirky out in the landscape because that's how they were inside.
Oh, I love that. That's really fun insight. I wonder if people even realize that about themselves. Some do, of course, but that might even be something that you're seeing that they're doing subconsciously and not even realizing why they like your design so much when it's complete.
Not to again veer, but I think we'll do this a lot. I think subconscious is something that most people don't realize comes into play.
Mhm.
If you walk into a house, you may not realize why a space feels just wonderful, but your subconscious is picking up on, well, that wall ends here, or
Yeah.
that's a half wall instead of a full wall, or there's glass block here instead of a solid wall. If you stare at it long enough, you probably do start to see it, but the instant reaction is your subconscious.
Yeah.
And I love putting detail in our designs that are maybe not ultra obvious, but because we picked up on something on the house and put it into the landscape, we're big fans of what we call lines of force, center lines of windows, center lines of doors, corners of the house. We tend to drag lines off of those first to kind of give us a framework to work within.
Mhm.
If you're lucky enough to have a house that's got a grid in it, the architect used an actual grid to lay out the house. Well,
Yeah.
you'd kind of be silly to not try to extend that grid out into the landscape. Um, Back to your original question,
Mhm.
I do like using linear groups of plants close to the house to reinforce the architecture. Or if the house has an angled wall, I'm going to put an angled planting near
Mhm.
it. So I tend to coordinate some groups of plants to play off the architecture of the house, but then the farther away we get, I let that dissolve a little bit and maybe become a little more loose. That's probably not necessarily a rule of thumb as much as it is our style.
I like that though. It also, again, slightly sideways follow-up question. Do you think about what's happening in the adjacent yards? And I'm certain that letting the linearness of responding to the house dissolve as you go away from it helps with that sort of transition as you go from one yard
Yeah,
to
I think so. You don't want, I've never been fond of architects who design a house that has zero context with its neighborhood.
another. Hmm.
Because to me, it literally looks like Dorothy's house fell out of the sky,
Yep,
landed
exactly.
in this neighborhood, and I would never do that with a landscape. Um, I understand the people who don't want to have a front lawn and instead install a prairie. I get that.
Hmm.
But it looks odd when the neighbors have these emerald green lawns on either side of it.
You can definitely see, I don't know, maybe sometimes people are very good friends with their neighbor that has an completely different lawn, but it doesn't look like they're friends.
Yes, that might be a good way to describe it. So, yeah, that dissolving idea does tend to allow the landscape to maybe at least look like it still fits with the neighborhood somewhat. Um, but our focus still is always our client and their house. I'm not going to let the neighborhood drive the design by any means.
So, what are the other levers you like to pull? I'm sure you work with hardscaping. Do you think about coming up in 3 dimensions with structures at all, or is that not your favorite way to move a landscape around?
No, in a perfect world, we could add verticality in a
Mhm.
landscape. The problem is those tend to be the more expensive elements
Right.
in terms of actual installation costs. So while I love designing pergolas, I practically can design a pergola with my eyes closed because of my architecture degree. I love them not because they create shade. And of course, I always remind clients it's never a solid shadow because it's an
Mhm.
open air structure. But I love that they help to define an outdoor room.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
whether that's for lounge furniture or dining, that vertical element defines that individual space from the rest of the patio.
Yeah.
And that's wonderful. The other way to do that is certainly what we call seat walls. They can be dry stacked stone, which is a little more economical, at least in environments where we have our freeze thaw cycles in the winter.
Mhm.
Because if you build a masonry wall or the classic poured concrete wall that you see in so many California landscapes,
Right.
not practical here in the Midwest. My concrete guy will tell you if you pour a concrete retaining wall, it may look great for 5 years, but once it's been through a few Wisconsin winters, it's likely going to get a crack somewhere.
Yeah.
Masonry seat walls, which means the stone is or brick is mortared together. That wall has to have a frost footing, which is
Mhm.
going 4 feet down into the soil. And the excavation cost of that, the concrete masonry unit core,
Yeah.
the time involved in mortaring every brick or stone piece onto that wall, and then providing a nice honed capstone on top of it. The last time I checked, a seat wall is running like $800 a lineal foot.
Wow. Yeah,
So
that's
a 10-foot long seat wall is suddenly $8,000 in your landscape.
and that sounds like a lot of money to me, and also it sounds perfectly appropriate for how much work goes into. Yeah, digging out a frost protected footing is no small endeavor.
No,
You might as well go ahead and make a building at that point.
you come close to that. Yep. I
Yeah.
mean, if you've ever seen the cost of just adding a three-season room onto a house,
Hmm. I know
um,
people are like, well, just not a real addition, just a three-season room. Like, well, it's in the Midwest, it is not that different.
no,
Maybe we should just make a real room and put a lot of screens in it so it can be both.
right.
But yeah. So those are the pricey pieces. I imagine those are also the pieces that are a little harder to change your mind around. From my perspective in design, I hate to see bad choices made or regrettable choices made, trendy choices made because I feel like they're just landfill in 5 or 10 or 15 years. And some of landscaping, I'm sure, can be composted, but the hardscaping that goes to the landfill as well, right?
Yeah, I think you make a really valid point there because at least landscaping maybe has a little bit more cushion or leeway in terms of its permanence.
Mhm.
If you move a load-bearing wall inside your house, you better make sure that was the right decision.
Yeah.
If you reclad a fireplace in your house, you're going to live with that decision for a long time, unless your budget is bottomless and you can just change it out a few years later.
And I have not met too many bottomless budgets, really at any price point. Whatever people's price point is, they still will come up with enough things they want to do that they'll fill up their budget with a more comprehensive wish list. They don't just want to spend the money and spend the money and spend the money repetitively.
No, our probably number one task is to make sure that a client's budget matches their wish list, and I'm sure you do the very same thing.
Mhm.
We both know what various things cost within our realms. And when a client says, I want these 10 things, but they give you a budget that can only cover five, we have to give them the bad news, right?
Yeah, and we try to do what we can to give them options so that they can find out what the local current pricing is and then choose what are their favorite features. But yeah, realism is always going to come in terms of cost. You can't have all the things at the highest quality for a very modest budget.
No, that's when I look at the list and I try to help the client prioritize.
Hmm.
If you want these 10 things, but if you had to break it down to five, what are really the five you absolutely want? And then we do our best to try to make that happen. Um, Plants are the wallpaper and paint color and carpet of the exterior world. They
Interesting.
they can be changed out. You can put in the yellow plant, and after a couple of years you don't like it, you can either get rid of it and put it in the compost pile, or maybe you move it to somewhere else in your yard.
Hmm.
Designing a patio space, a pergola, seat walls, a permanent fire pit, those are the decisions that need to be really thought out. And that, you can DIY plantings all day long, but I
Yeah.
don't know that clients should be designing their outdoor space on their own without some guidance, without understanding, how much room will that dining set take up, the
Right.
grilling area, have you accounted for circulation, um, the practicality of getting to the faucet with the hose reel, just there's a myriad of things. Honestly, it's no different to me than you designing an interior space and realizing that if you put the door here instead of here, you're going to mess up any possible furniture layout in that room.
Right.
So that's how we look at outdoor spaces.
There are a lot. It's funny because you feel like, oh, well, I'll just go around it, but it's really inconvenient. Maybe in some ways more so without the definition of walls. I think it can be harder to realize how much space things take, and it feels so wrong to step off the hardscape on a regular basis to get around something. It feels like, well, I just can't get to there. The
My
proportions are so important.
my favorite thing for bad reasons that I see on house are fire pit areas where the chair legs are pushed out to the very edge of the paving,
Hmm.
because
So
you
uncomfortable.
know that if the fire is too hot, you won't be able to slide your chair any farther away from the fire. And then you even notice that the chairs themselves are maybe 12 or 18 inches away from the actual fire bowl. And you say, well, what if someone needs to get up and walk away?
They're going
So
out in the grass.
yeah, I mean, our minimum diameter for a fire pit patio is 15 feet across. Anything smaller than that, there is not going to be room for chairs in circulation in the actual fire pit.
Well, these are really good things to note. And I think there's so much complexity. It's really a challenge for anyone who doesn't do this all day every day and hear other people's sob stories to hold it all in their head. But there are definitely some errors to avoid. Do you feel like you've got any biggest pet peeves in terms of things you see people do that generally are a bad idea or that are in my interest, specifically a bad fit for mid-century designs?
Um, I think pet peeves certainly would be a couple of things we've already talked about. The Don't try to make your front yard look like it's in Palm Springs and you live in
Uh-huh.
Minnesota. Um, don't design hardscapes that are too small for practical use. The worst thing you can do is hire a concrete contractor to put in a 12 by 20 rectangle on the back of your ranch home and then start placing your furniture on it and realize, oh, we didn't think this through.
Yeah.
Um, because then to like, you can't even afford to have a concrete person come back and add a few more feet onto it. It'll
Mhm.
look like a Band-Aid. So plan, plan, plan. Um, if one thing good came of the pandemic to me is that the world has slowed down a little. My carpenter still says, we're in this next day mentality because of Amazon.
Mhm.
But I believe that all these decisions are so important because most of them can't be changed.
Yeah.
So I'm a big believer in thinking this process through, especially with the hardscapes. Again, whether there's a rose next to the patio or a lilac or a boxwood, honestly doesn't matter. But it's designing the outdoor spaces to function properly, number one, because they really do need to function before anything else. But then number two, aesthetically look like they belong to that particular house.
Yeah.
Other things to avoid: wrong plant in wrong place. Verify how big something is going to get before you pick it out because you just like what it looks like.
Right.
Doodle, I just start with circles, and that's a great way to sort of build a landscape design from nothing, is to just draw circles and then look at a certain circle and say, well, I think I want something that's going to get 6 feet high there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now you have a much shorter list of plants to investigate than if you had just said, well, I think I need a shrub on that corner.
Oh, that's a really good point. Yeah, then you can go looking for the right type of something for your climate zone, something that's the right height and general width, much shorter list.
Yeah, because if you force a plant into a spot that you have to constantly trim it just to make it fit, you're going to regret that decision. The plant will never look good because you're forcing it by constantly trimming it. And it may die eventually because you were stressing it out every time you trimmed it.
Yeah.
So it really is about, I mean, lots of gardeners have this bad habit of trying plants out, even though they know, they may not be hardy in the area. It sometimes takes me 3 tries before I realize I should raise the white flag and just not try that plant anymore. But look around at what the neighbors have. Clearly, if they're doing well in the neighbor's yard, that's a plant that's likely going to do well in your yard.
Mm-hmm.
Big fan of getting knowledge from people who work at the local garden center. Sometimes the local college will have an extension office that you can reach out to and say, what are the top 10 trees that grow well in my state?
Yeah.
The information
Huh.
is out there.
Do you find, I mean, you have your own knowledge base, but do you find that there are research materials you go to, Wisconsin Extension or some national database or something, particularly actually if you're working slightly out your own, now that you're working in further places, where do you go to look up local climate zone information for someone in Michigan or in Kansas?
Well, we do follow the USDA zone map. That's
Right.
our starting point. Local garden centers, the major ones tend to have really great websites
Mm-hmm.
where if they're selling these plants locally, then I know my client will be able to get them,
Right.
and the garden center wouldn't be selling plants that die,
Yeah.
quite honestly.
They don't
So
want unhappy customers.
correct. So I think a local garden center website is a great place to start. I'm a big fan of it's the Missouri Botanical Garden. They use the acronym MOBOT, MOBOT.org is their website. And they have a plant database that is 100% searchable. So you can put in your zone, you can put in what height you want, bloom color, etc. And every now and then, when I can't think of a certain plant I want to use, or maybe a plant is a little unfamiliar to me, I go to that website, look up that plant, verify how big it gets. And because they're a botanical garden, they give honest information about the hardiness of that plant. Is it invasive? And
Mm-hmm.
those factors.
Nice. Oh, that's a great resource. Now I'm going to go have some fun with Google tonight.
Yep.
Marvelous. Well, oh my gosh, we have gone so far past our planned time
It's
because
okay.
there's so much to say, but we're just going to have you back for another soon podcast interview. And I think we've gotten some of the questions asked by our listeners answered, not all of them. We'll have to do it again. What actually I had a thing popped into my head while we were going through. This is putting you on the spot. But do you feel like there's a signature landscape move by decade when you look at a house, or particularly when you look at the yard around a house? Can you tell yourself, oh yeah, there's that? You mentioned the white chip from the 70s. Are there things that feel like key indicators from a certain era to you?
Yeah, there. I think there were certain plants available at certain times. Um, wouldn't call them trends necessarily, like maybe paint colors would be, or avocado appliances
Right.
definitely date themselves. Um, but as we talked about, there were really only 3 or 4 shrubs available in the 50s and 60s. They were the forsythia, the lilac, um, the purple leaf plum, also called the purple sand cherry, the blue spruce, the crabapple. Those are just the plants that were available during that time period. Into the 70s, you started to see the glazed tile, I think, a lot on exteriors,
Oh,
that rusty red. Redwood stained furniture was a thing of the 70s. Patio furniture back then all seemed to be this redwood color. The marble chip is definitely a 70s thing. Landscape lights, the actual fixtures can sometimes tell you what time period they are from because of their style. The 50s and 60s had these almost mushroom looking lights.
mm-hmm.
Then the style starts to change and you start to sense that, well, maybe I'm in the 70s and 80s. The ornamental grasses came into play in the late 80s and early 90s. So as soon as you see those in a landscape, you know it's at least from that time period forward. And perennials have exploded in the last 20 or 30 years. Um, Even lots of shrubs now, the growers are tinkering with them, practically Frankenstein-like. And when there might have only been 3 hydrangeas 20 years ago, now there's 50 different hydrangeas out there. So the longer we go through our time here, it's, I think, going to be harder to tell when a landscape was specifically done. But I do think through the 80s and even into the 90s, you can definitely see the era that those might have been done.
Interesting. Fun. Well, and probably as we look back from the future, we'll be able to identify things more clearly. It's always hard to see what's on trend when it's
And you're
on
in
trend.
it.
It
Yeah,
just seems normal.
right.
Um, this has been so useful. I think there's some really good tips that people can take away from making good choices for their house. But I have to agree with you. I think some of these things, in particular hardscaping, the very best move anyone can make is check in with professional. Make
For
sure
sure.
that those unknown factors are being accounted for, because these decisions are going to last and you want to make the right ones before you invest your money in someone else doing it or your own labor in DIYing something. I think sometimes I feel like that hurts even more if you do that all that work yourself and then you look back on it and you're like, oh, if only I had considered X.
If you DIY it, which I'm a big fan of because I do it in my own yard, yes, I think mistakes can hurt, and maybe more personally than financially.
To remember exactly how much you labored over that thing
Yeah, the
and
time,
now
the
you don't
time
want
you
to do it
spent.
again.
Right. But on the other hand, the sheer costs, and landscapes are not inexpensive
Mhm.
nowadays. Um, Mistakes cost money. I think there was a meme that I saw years ago that said something along the lines like, it's very expensive not to hire a professional.
Yeah, I agree. And I think when you're building, it's very expensive not to hire a designer, whether that's inside or out.
Mhm.
Not just an opinion, but
No, we may be biased because of what we do, but I'm sure you've visited homes where you see something that was done and you shake your head and you calculate the costs in your head and you say, wow, I feel so bad either for these people or I don't know why the previous owners did this.
so many clients come to me with houses that we both are just like, what were they thinking? What on earth was the perceived value of this choice? But then we start from where we are
Right.
and move on forward.
I think everything's fixable.
Right. It is, and there's always a silver lining to a challenge. When we get a time capsule house that needs some maintenance work, but nothing's ever been done to it, we really can build on the things that are there. You get perhaps a completely wild and uncared for yard, you really have kind of a blank slate to make great moves there. If you get something that's more overdone, maybe you have something you could work from as you work backwards towards something that's closer to what works for the house and works for the client. And there's always positives.
We're not tied to only new, blank slate designs versus enhancing what's there.
Mm-hmm.
We'll go from one end of the scale to the other that way. If someone says, well, I certainly don't want to take out that tree, then I will work around that tree. But we also investigate the health of the plants that are there too, because an old landscape is declining, and that's just a simple fact of nature.
You don't want to plan an elaborate hardscaping project around a willow that's about to fall over sideways.
Thank you. I just had that conversation with someone last week.
That's what I know. I know that much from my own childhood because my dad loved a willow in our yard and we tried to plan for it, and then it basically rotted from the inside and fell in half while we lived there, which broke his heart because he is very soft-hearted about plants and loves to nurse them back to health. It was just senescent.
Yep.
So if people want to get in touch with you, if they want to admire your beautiful work, where is the best place for them to find it?
Our website, if you want to see our portfolio of work, is www.ginkgoleafstudio.net. And Ginkgo is spelled Ginkgo. Lots of people misspell Ginkgo. When I started my business, I thought Drzewiecki would be hard to spell, but Ginkgo has proven worse.
Oh, no.
So,
do you ever think about getting the alternate spelling website and just redirecting it to yours?
Yeah, actually, it normally happens, but emails are the problem, because if you misspell Ginkgo in my email, I'm not getting it. So
how can someone get in touch with you? Is it clearly marked on your website?
Yeah. There's a contact us page on our website. Our website does have a mid-century modern section because we have done so many of those projects. I believe we also have a contemporary/modern section as well as a traditional. So you can really see the gamut of our work on our website. We have, a Facebook page, an Instagram account, and a much larger version of our portfolio is on our house profile as well.
Nice. And, for some people who are listening, they might have a more modern/mid-century house, and they might want to do more modern contemporary landscaping around it. And some people are more mid-century traditional or mid-mod, and they're looking for something that hits it. So a lot of these gorgeous examples are going to be really exciting. I will put links to several of your projects and your website on our show notes page.
Thank you.
And people can learn all about it there. Thanks again to Jim for this fabulous download of design ideas, history, and inspiration for our mid-century yards. If you want to see what we've been talking about, or just review the advice that Jim shared today in detail, find the transcript of this episode, plus links and photos at the show notes page, midmod-midwest.com/1703. We covered so much ground in this episode that you might be surprised that we left quite a few pre-submitted questions unanswered, unless you were one of several folks who put in questions about landscapes and yards into the season question form. So if we didn't get to yours. Never fear. Jim and I are already cooking up a plan to do this again soon, later this season, I think. And next time we will cover even more ground and even more of your questions. But next week on the podcast, we are jumping off from something Jim talked about. His early inspiration to become a designer was based on a tour of the Frank Lloyd Wright Johnson Wax facility in Racine, Wisconsin. He's not the only person who makes a connection between Wright and the right choices for mid-century design. So tune in next week for a discussion of how Frank Lloyd Wright influenced mid-mod design and how you can infuse a little prairie style or Usonian influences into your home if you want to. See you then.